vocal folds in the larynx come together and vibrate in the airflow from the lungs. And that is what gives us the buzz of voice, and we can make that buzz, we can make that vibration occur at different speeds. So sometimes the vocal folds vibrate relatively slowly, sometimes relatively fast. And the faster the frequency at which they vibrate, the higher the pitch that we hear. So pitch is what we hear as the melody of the voice. So when it goes up or down, that correlates with the rate of vibration, frequency, speed, if you like, of the vibration of the vocal folds in the larynx. The higher the frequency of vibration, the higher the pitch you hear. Okay? And I also thought maybe I would just show you this overhead here to explain what the interlinear notation is trying to do. It is a little graph to show the high pitch versus the low pitch. It's almost like on a musical stage. But I'm comparing it here with plots taken from the laryngograph, which actually monitors the rate of vocal fold vibration and then can be converted into a graph of this type, a plot frequency against time. And these were my pronunciations of the word Y, using all the different nuclear tones. So I hope you can see that the little interlinear notations we use are an approximation to that kind of thing. We just use a big blob to show a stressed syllable, and then the direction is shown by the line. So that's Y, 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 Y. There's a subtle difference in the starting point of those rises. And Y, if you get a chance to use the laryngograph yourself while you're here, and there may be opportunities for at least some of you, you can try these out for yourselves and see if you get the visual display that you expect associated with these particular patterns. And certainly you will have more information given to you about this in Mark Huckvale's lecture next week, when he talks about making pitch visible. So but I thought I'd better just put that little bit of background in. Of course, we don't speak on monotones most of the time. And here's a plot, which one of my groups has already seen, of whole phrases and the laryngograph plot that goes with them. The top sentence there is, an accent is pitch prominent. An accent is pitch prominent. And you will see there are breaks in the squiggly line because of the voiceless consonants that break up the speech. When there's no voice, there's no pitch. An accent is pitch prominent. You've got x and p in the middle there. And it was demonstrating the pitch prominence. You've got a high pitch on ac, a low pitch on pitch, and then a high one again on prom. So all those three syllables were accented. And then the bottom one, I'll be doing my phonetics homework on Friday. 4 stresses, but only 2 accents. The ones which are pitch prominent being the do there, which jumps up, and the home, which starts that nuclear fold there. Net and fry are just rhythmically prominent, they don't stick out in pitch. So that's what a plot, a fundamental frequency, which is what it's called, frequency of the vocal fold vibration, fundamental frequency against time, and it correlates closely to what we hear as pitch. So we hear the melody of the voice doing similar things. Okay, that's just by way of background. Now to move on to prenuclear patterns. That's the first page of your handout, so you've got it in front of you as well. Some reminders, first of all. The constituents of the word group are optional prehead, optional head, obligatory nucleus, and optional tail. Within a word group, any syllables preceding the nucleus will form part of a head or a prehead. Okay? So the example there given to you is, there's a lecture at 3 o'clock today. There's a lecture at 3 o'clock today. Okay? And if we analyse that into the component parts, we find that the nucleus is on clock, just a single syllable. The tail, as we were looking at yesterday, follows the nucleus there on today. And then before the nucleus, we've got both a prehead on those first two unstressed syllables, there's a, and then the head is lecturat threa. That stretches over all those syllables. Lecturat threa is the head. There's a, the prehead. The head starts on the first accented syllable in the group, which we sometimes call the onset, and it contains all subsequent syllables, accented or unaccented, up to the nucleus. So it's it's an extendable thing. The nucleus is only one syllable. All the other constituents can extend over however many syllables there are available. And the prehead consists of any unaccented syllables at the beginning of the group. If there are no accented syllables before the nucleus, then there's no head. So that next example, that's fine. We've just got prehead and nucleus. And the next one, certainly, madam, you've just got nucleus and tail. We did some of these, looked at some of these groups yesterday. It's the same thing. And similarly, if the word group begins with an accented syllable, then there's no prehead. So it could start with a high head, for example, and you know it's an accent because of the relative height of the pitch. Shut the door, shut the door. Shut the is the head, door is your low-rise nucleus. And then you can just simply have nucleus and tail, and there will be no prehead either there. If you just say wonderful, wonderful. Okay. You try those out. I can see you're dying to try them out, so let's do them all. That's fine. Yeah. Certainly, madam. Certainly, madam. Shut the door. Shut the door. Wonderful. Wonderful. Oh, yes, give this rise fall very well. Good. Okay. Now let's move on then to the head types that we can have. Well, the heads are extendable stretches of speech, as we've said. There doesn't have to be just one syllable. You can have quite a number of syllables in a head. So there's really quite a lot of scope for what the pitch can do. I mean, all pitch can do is go up, down, or stay level, but if you've got several syllables to play with, then there's all sorts of things it could be doing. And in practice, when you're listening, you will hear a wide variety of things going on in that kind of position. However, people who have analysed intonation have discovered that in general there are some basic types of head which recur and which therefore can be considered to be the head types characteristic of English, at least of RP English and most of the standard varieties. And the heads that I'm going to be talking about today are the ones which have been suggested as perhaps occurring most commonly. I'll give you some examples at the end which are not on the handout of other sorts which can also occur, which are perhaps slightly less common. But basically the pattern in heads is either level, rising or falling. And the commonest head types are, first of all, the high head. Now this is a relatively level head, and it's also relatively high. The way it's illustrated on the handout, it looks as though it's very high. It doesn't have to be very high. It can be actually anything down to a fairly mid-level, and we still regard it as the high head, the high-level head. So that example on the handout there, the first one, I'll give you a ring this evening. I'll give you a ring this evening. I better conduct this one, haven't I? I'll give you a ring this evening. I'll give you a ring this evening. Yeah, you're very good at imitating, that's good. So what you do is you rise up to the first accent there, I'll give. That establishes the starting point of the head, and then the pitch stays relatively level after that until you get to the nucleus. So there is an additional stressed syllable in there, the word ring. I'll give you a ring this, but it doesn't stick out, it's not prominent in pitch. So we don't regard it as another accent there. The high level head, level throughout. Where I demonstrated it there was relatively high. I'll give you a ring this evening. Sometimes it's not as high as that. I'll give you a ring this evening. I'll give you a ring this evening. As long as it's relatively high compared with the speaker's baseline, we regard it as high and level. Now, of course, heads can be as short as a single syllable. So if it's a single syllable head, then you simply mark, that particular head is simply marked by high pitch. The next example shows, I'll be right there, I'll be right there, that's it. That's it, so all you have to do is jump up, hit a high note on the right, and then get to your nucleus. I'll be right there. You don't have to worry about sustaining a level pitch because it's just the one syllable there. Okay, so that's the sort of the basic high head. But then there's an emphatic version of the high head. And in the emphatic version, you can only have an emphatic version if you've got more than one accent in the head. So you'd have to have at least another stressed syllable which you then wanted to make prominent with pitch in order to have this emphatic version. Then successive accents can step down in pitch and give you a stepping head. Now, let me demonstrate this one. It simply can't be tolerated, right? It simply can't be tolerated. So what you're doing is jumping up at the beginning, exactly as you did for the high level head. And so in this first foot, this first little accent group here, simply the pitch stays up. And then the next one, you just jump down a little bit in pitch. Can't be, and then make it level again. It's like going down a staircase. Simply can't be, and then whatever nucleus you have afterwards, tolerated here, a relatively low fall. You could have it with a high fall as well. It simply can't be tolerated. Right. You could have it with a low rise. I mean, the words would sound funny with a low rise, but we can always practice it. It simply can't be tolerated. It simply can't be tolerated. That's it. The more often you jump around in pitch, the more emphatic it tends to sound. I think a lot of you feel that English people sound emphatic most of the time anyway, using much too wide a pitch range compared with what you normally use, so that's true for some of you at any rate. But we have ways of having more emphatic and less emphatic versions. And this stepping head, it's actually quite a common one. We call it an emphatic one, but you'll hear it quite a lot. It's a variant of the high level head, simply because you're establishing level pitch at each accent, and it also has the same distribution really as the high level head. It can occur very widely in very similar circumstances to convey similar attitudes before most of the nuclear tones. In fact, it can occur in any of the nuclear tones, but it's slightly less common in front of the full rise. This is largely because the full rise usually has a different head, which we'll look at in a minute. The little stress mark is the actual intonation mark that you use for accents in a high head. So if you're interested in the notation, you'll see I've used the little high head mark, which is the same as a stress mark, in front of give in the first example, right in the second, and before both simply and can't in the stepping head. So in front of any accents in the head, you put that marker. Now, the second head that's of relevance is the low head. The pitch stays very low and level throughout the head. Okay? So when I said with the high head, it can be really quite high, or it can be sort of medium height. There's quite a lot of leeway. As far as the low head's concerned, it's got to be really low. It's got to be right down at the bottom of your pitch range. So the example here. You can't go on like that. More or less. I'll do it once more. You can't go on like that. Good. Yes. Don't forget to go up again at the end as well with a little rise. So you really have to jump down to it. You can't go on like that. Come on, you can do it again if you want. It's pitch prominent in a funny way, if you like. It's pitch prominent in the sense that you're going right down to an extreme in your voice rather than going up to a high level from somewhere comfortably in the middle. And similarly to the high head, if there's just a single syllable in the head, then it's just a low-pitched syllable. Why should I? Why should I? Now, there isn't an emphatic version of this particular head. There isn't a sort of jumping up one, there isn't a staircase up. You can't go on like that. It sounds odd. Doesn't seem to fit in with the patterns for English. Does anybody have any intuitions about the sort of occasions you might want to use a low head like that? I don't think that's important, yeah? Come here. When you're reproaching somebody, yes, it tends to sound a little bit hostile, a little bit suspicious, all sorts of funny things. Usually rather a negative connotation connected with that particular head. It also is fairly restricted in its distribution because we generally use it in front of a low rise. The low rise can be preceded by other heads as well, but the low head usually has a low rise following it. It tends to sound rather funny if we try and follow it with a high fall, for example. You can't go on like that. How odd. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it does sound marked. It sounds odd in some way. It's not a usual head. And notice also that the onset accent is given a particular little marker, which is like a low stress mark. You may be used to using a little marker like that to mark secondary stress. As far as intonation is concerned, that means a low head. Then we have rising heads. Okay. The pitch starts low, rises gradually throughout the head. So something like, it ought to be obvious. It ought to be obvious. Good, good. And if it's a single syllable head, why not? Then the pitch on that head actually has to move. It has to be rising on the Y. Why not? So it sounds exactly the same as a low rise nucleus, but the fact that it's followed immediately by that high fall tells us that it's actually the head. Why not? Now, on your handouts, you probably haven't got the tail extended to the bottom there, have you? I noticed that as I was looking through it. It should have been extended to the baseline on the nucleus. It makes it look on your handout if it says why not, and that sounds very strange. It's meant to go right down to the bottom. Okay. Okay. Then, if we move on, and there is an emphatic version of that's the wrong page. And the emphatic version of the rising head is called the climbing head. Well, we have to think of some new word in the vocabulary. We've got rising, climbing. Some people say ascending. I mean, you know, got to think of something to differentiate them. And you'll see that this is sort of similar to the stepping head in the way that successive accents behave. Again, you can only have this emphatic version if you've got a longish head with the possibility of more than one accent in it. The pitch of the successive accented syllables drops down again and establishes a new starting point for the rising position. So if I read you the example there, so will you be coming or won't you? Will you be coming or won't you? Will you be coming or won't you? That's it. So you can see that that's slightly different from the simple rising head. If it had been a simple rising head, then the pitch, the rises would have just gone regularly from syllable to syllable. I've done something like saying, will you be coming or won't you? But to give that extra emphasis, will you be coming or won't you? Drops down again and starts again. So it's a little rise starting on will, and then a new rise starting at a different point on come, and then gradually going up to the nucleus. Will you be coming or won't you? Usually, the rising and climbing heads are followed by a high fall. It's also possible for them to be followed by low falls and rise falls, but the high fall is the commonest. You've got the little up arrow marker that you can use in front of accented syllables in that kind of head. Does anybody have any intuitions about the sort of circumstances in which you would use those? Will you be coming or won't you? Impatience. Yes? If I tell you that it's sometimes been described, the whole pattern there, with either the rising or climbing head followed by a high fall, it's been described in some of the American literature on intonation as the surprise redundancy contour. Surprise-redundancy. In other words, both meanings are often associated with that particular tune, that combination. Because we tend to use it when we think the listener ought to know already what we're telling him. So if I said to you, the lecture starts at 3, I mean, it would sound impatient because the implication is that you ought to know that. You should have read your notes. If I was just telling you politely, I would say, the lecture starts at 3. But the lecture starts at 3. Begin to sound a little bit exasperated because you don't know, you haven't looked it up. Yeah. And there's certainly exasperation in that example I gave you there, but that's partly in the vocabulary as well, of course. Will you be coming or won't you? It's about time you told me. It ought to be redundant, the fact that I am saying this to you. And there's an element of surprise that you don't know already as well. So it has a very special sort of connotation, that particular pattern. Having said that, you then have to be careful because some varieties of English tend to use it as a much more unmarked variety of head than we do in RP English. I've heard a number of English speakers from Wales who use this kind of contour quite a lot, and if there are any Welsh speakers here, they may want to argue with me, but I certainly know I've met some who seem to use this as a fairly standard part of their intonation, and it doesn't have those connotations. So that's always a caveat when we're talking about the intonation of English. Some varieties of English have slightly different usages of some of the same patterns. Okay, so the pitch can stay level, either high or low. It can go up, and guess what? It can also go down. So we have the falling head. Yes, you can see those are falling up. In this case, the pitch starts high, but then falls gradually throughout the head. So the example there, I wouldn't call it cold. I wouldn't call it cold. That's it. Just a very gradual fall. It's not a big steep fall like you get on a nucleus. I wouldn't call it cold. I wouldn't call it cold. It's giving you practice at your full rise as well. Cold. Yeah. And again, if the head is restricted to a single syllable, then you have to make the pitch move on that single syllable. I don't think so. That's right, yes, good. But there, the little pitch movement you get on a word like don't, I don't think so. bit. It doesn't go right down to the bottom. You don't say, I don't think so. It's don't, stops at some mid-level, and then goes on to the nucleus. Notice that I'm using this in front of the fall rise because this is the commonest nuclear tone that it would actually go with. And the same is true for the emphatic version of this head, which is called the sliding head. So again, we have to find a new word in the vocabulary to make a difference between falling and falling in a different way. So we call it sliding. And here, exactly the same principle with successive accents in this position. Each successive accent jumps up a little bit in pitch and re-establishes the point from which the fall starts. So the example here, it was terribly expensive to install. It was terribly expensive to install. Right? That's it, right. So the thing is to get down to a certain point and terribly, and then re-establish it. Expensive to install. Yeah. To do it without that extra boost in the middle would actually mean you had to plan your fall quite carefully because there's a lot of syllables there, aren't there? Terribly expensive to can do it. It's terribly expensive to install. That's just a simple falling head, but then with the extra boost, terribly expensive to install. And the more jumps about that you have, the more emphatic it tends to sound, right? So it becomes less neutral. The unemphatic versions are at some level more neutral, and these emphatic versions, they have extra speaker involvement in them, I think. You can find the falling and the sliding heads preceding a number of nuclear tones, but they are most commonly found before the fall rise. It's, if you like, it's a holistic combination that you often find. This, when I say holistic, I mean the combination of the head and the nucleus itself makes a well-recognized tune, which people, there isn't a label for it like surprise redundancy, but you could say it all goes together with the sense of reservation that you very often get with the fall-rise nuclear tone. The little marker that's used in front of the accents there is a little down arrow for those of you who are interested in the notation. I've just got a few other examples here. Some more examples of high heads, both the simple ones and the stepping one, the emphatic one. I've marked on the slide there the A's and the N's. A simply means here is an accent. N means here is a nucleus, which is of course also an accent. S means here is a stressed syllable, which isn't an accent or a nucleus, so it's just marking them up a little bit more for you. And I've bracketed in the text what the head actually is. Okay. So rather than me just demonstrating them, I wonder if you can do them about that. I'll demonstrate the first one, then I'll point to the ones I want to do. Will you be long? Right, good. Now try that one. All together now. Good. Right. Come back. Good. And this long one here, let's see if we can do that. examples of the falling head. Okay, all together, let me see if you're doing it. Ah, yes, well, there are at least some right ones there. Good. It isn't very easy. Right, and this one. That's right, it's not mine. Good. Yeah. And with the extra emphasis, the sliding version. Yeah, I think he was very worried. That's it. And that's right. Actually, all right. I don't believe that. Yes. Like that. Now here's Sam to tops you a little bit. Excuse me while I look at it. Here we are. So they're not on the handout because they're what we call mixed heads. Most of the heads, well, all the heads we've looked at so far are consistent throughout their length, aren't they? It's because if you have a stepping head, then it's going to be at a level pitch. Each accent is going to start you on a level pitch. If you have a climbing head, then each accent is going to start a rise. If you have a sliding head, then each accent is going to start a fall. You do come across mixed heads sometimes, where each accent starts something different. So this one here starts off with like a level head, and then switches in the middle to a rising head. It was a really important decision. Very good. And here you start with a full and then go to a rise. Why don't you say what you mean? Yeah, it still sounds quite natural, doesn't it? Still do these. Here, starts level and then switches to a fall. He wouldn't have done it on purpose. Right. So it's like a falling head, but a little bit delayed. You start off with a level bit and then move down. There again, these are quite common. The ones that you want to sort of really home in on and learn are the ones which are consistent throughout, the ones on the handout. But if you start listening and analysing the intonation of real speakers of English, you'll find examples of this kind of thing as well. So it would be, I think, misleading to try and tell you that all you ever get in English are the ones on the handout, because you do get all sorts of other things as well. Okay. Move on to pre-heads then to end up with. These are really quite straightforward. Preheads are described as either low or high. The low prehead is the most usual one, and it's produced at a comfortable pitch, somewhere below the middle of the speaker's range. Now, on the handout, because of the way I did it on the computer, it looks as though it's bang in the middle, but in fact it could be anywhere between the middle and somewhere lower, certainly no higher. So if I say something like, I'd love to, I'd love to, the starting pitch there is just the kind of comfortable pitch that I would, vocalise at if all other things being equal. It doesn't it's not particularly high, it's not particularly low, but it's not, it's on the lower end of the range. And the next example, it's a matter of principle. That's right. The it's there is something you just throw away, don't worry about. It's just on whatever pitch is comfortable, really. If you're marking intonation, there isn't a marker for the low prehead, it's just left unmarked. The high prehead is a bit less common, and again adds extra emphasis, because your high prehead is normally followed by something that's a bit lower, so establishes a wider range. That gives you the emphasis. The pitch is then noticeably above mid-level. You recognise a high-pitched prehead when you hear one, because it really is quite high. So that first example, I'd love to. Right, you have to sort of get right up there, don't you? I'd love to. Good, and the next one, it's a matter of principle. both those preheads can co-occur with any head or nucleus, but in fact the high preheads are more likely, they're more common when the first accent is relatively low. Because you like to make a contrast. If you're using a high prehead, you don't want to follow it immediately by a high head usually, because, well, sometimes that happens, but in order to get the emphasis in, you want to jump down in pitch to something. So that first example jumped down to the onset of a low fall. Second one jumped down to the beginning of a rising head. And you use that little horizontal marker as the indicator of a high prehead. Okay, the paragraph at the bottom of the handout there is just to make a point about the way we're using these heads in combination with the nuclei. If we think about pitch range, which is sometimes described as key in the literature, speakers use a wide pitch range when they want to indicate excitement, urgency, emotion, involvement, and so forth. You also use a higher pitch to attract attention or to start a new topic in the discourse and so forth. Whereas a narrow, rather low pitch range, if I speak all down here all the time, it can establish, what it actually indicates is that I'm feeling a little bit detached, I'm not very emotional, I might even be feeling rather depressed. Basically, you're going to fall asleep if you have to listen to me talking like this for very much longer. Okay, and sometimes we also, in a more linguistic or paralinguistic perhaps way, use low-pitched stretch, sorry, not low-pitched, but a compressed range at the bottom end of our range to indicate asides, parenthetical expressions, something that's less important. I won't go into that in detail now. Really the point I'm making is that the choice of the prenuclear pattern helps the speaker to establish whether they're going to be using a wide or a narrow range. The emphatic heads also allow greater pitch variation within the word group, which gives you a much sort of spikier effect, with dee-dee-dee-dee-dee sort of effect, very spiky. That sounds emphatic, it sounds involved, it sounds animated. And as I mentioned, using the high prehead and then following it by something low can also establish that you're using a wide range, that you're jumping around in pitch to indicate greater excitement and